Ever since its widespread release on home computers and consoles in the late 80s, Tetris has been a force to be reckoned with in the video game market. It is probably the most consistently ported game ever made, with a version of the game being playable on virtually every major gaming platform since the Commodore 64 up to modern virtual reality systems. There's a commercial reason for this fact, as you might expect. The intuitive nature of its gameplay loop leads Tetris to appeal to the highly lucrative, casual gaming audience, and has made various versions of the game to form the second best-selling video game franchise of all time. Only when you add up all the sales of every Mario game ever made can you find a franchise that has turned a bigger profit. Many of these Tetris variants are simply ports and visual updates of classic Tetris for newer gaming platforms. On the other hand, there are additions that come with new modes that alter the way the game is played. Some variations simply change the speed at which the pieces fall, such as the sprint and marathon modes found in several Tetris games. However, other installments feature modes that dramatically change broader aspects of playing Tetris, like playing to outlast an opponent in competitive multiplayer, or even making your way through a story mode like in a more standard single-player game. Only one variant, however, truly changes what I would consider the experience of playing Tetris, though, and it does so by utilizing the design methodology known as game feel. That game is Tetris Effect. Defined in many a game developer's conference talk, game feel, also known as juice, is a game design concept which is somewhat hard to define because it can be applied to many different areas of a game. It can be broadly stated as something a developer adds to a game to improve the sensory experience which the game provides the player. In terms of senses, the three that video games primarily target are sight, hearing, and touch. When discussing game feel, these senses correlate to visuals, audio, and input and response. Altering the visuals of a game, and in particular adding moving visuals like particle effects or muzzle flare, can dramatically increase player engagement and enjoyability of a game. The same can be said for sound, as I'm sure everyone can remember a time when they played a game where the sound effects and music flowed together and inspired them to push on. Input and response deal with the receptiveness of the mechanics and how efficient the flow of the gameplay experience is, something Tetris Effect exemplifies in its transitions. Tetris Effect combines all three of these aspects of game feel to transform the traditional Tetris experience into something that feels entirely different. The first thing you'll notice about Tetris Effect is how different it looks compared to the classic versions of the game you played when you were younger. Those older versions typically had a very simple visual palette that wasn't meant to wow anyone with fantastic graphics. Instead, the standard colors of the tetrominoes are used to help players distinguish between the different pieces more quickly, to make the game more accessible and fast-paced. This simple visual format has largely stayed consistent over the many iterations of Tetris and for good game design reasons. There are also equally valid reasons as to why the makers of Tetris Effect decided to head in the other direction and make the aesthetic of their Tetris game a central selling point. The very first level of the game is a great example of how Tetris Effect uses visuals to enhance the classic Tetris gameplay. The level starts out taking place in a seemingly dark spot in the ocean, with little fish swimming around the board. Many levels in the game begin like this, with muted visuals, as they ramp into more complex graphics later on. Once the player gets through about a third of their lines, the fish turn into larger manta rays that glide around the screen. Then, after the player gets through 2/3 of their lines, about 24 in normal mode, the finale of the level occurs where the camera pans out to show the Earth surrounded by swimming fish and a giant whale. The pure visual spectacle of the stage finales in Tetris Effect give the player a new motivation to improve their skills and complete levels outside of mechanics, similar to how progressing through a story would function in other games. Elements like the glow of tiles when completing a line before they fade away add weight to the mechanical elements of the game and make manipulating tiles more satisfying than in more visually simple versions of Tetris. Sound and music play a similar role to the graphics in Tetris Effect because of how they motivate and pump up the player. People who haven't even played Tetris would be familiar with the classic Type A song if they heard it. The fast-paced melody, which was derived from an old Russian folk song, has pushed millions of players through many difficult Tetris scenarios over the past 30 years. The audio designers of Tetris Effect made sure that the music was still a focal point in this new edition, but with a twist. Instead of starting out with the complete, ramped-up version of a song, the levels begin rather quietly, and add more bass and pace as the player progresses. This gradual crescendo builds in 3 stages in tandem with the visuals, growing more and more immersive at 1/3 and 2/3 of the way through each stage. While there is a wide variety of music, from a cappella to nature sounds to what I can only describe as South Asian dubstep, each track keeps in mind the legacy of the classic Tetris themes and that they keep the player on their toes and immersed in the act of efficiently dropping pieces. As an example, here's the first level of the game again, but now with sound. If that doesn't make you feel something, I don't know what will. It is key that there is a gradual build in both sound and visuals in each level, because of how groups of individual stages meld together when playing. The visual and auditory enhancements to game feel are supplemented well by how Tetris Effect adds to the typical Tetris formula by changing up how its levels are framed and transition between. Each level before the finale is a part of a larger set of 3 to 5 stages. Most Tetris games and modes have the player play until they lose and bring up a menu asking the player whether they would like to try again or select another mode. This can tend to be a jarring experience after losing a high-paced game where piece placement has gotten out of control. In contrast, the transition between levels in Tetris Effect feels like a satisfying reward for playing the game well. As the final row, or set of rows, is completed by placing down the final piece of a level, the rows begin to glow, the music begins to fade, and the player is immediately whisked into the next stage in a flashy transition where the visuals for the completed stage fade out and new stimuli fade in. These smooth shifts between stages keep the player in a consistent flow state while they are playing well, rather than taking them out of it only when they are starting to perform poorly. In combination with the range of visuals and music from level to level, the transitions of Tetris Effect lead to a more cohesive and immersive experience than any version of Tetris that came before it. Designers who understand and utilize the theory of game feel can make their games more attention-grabbing and more likely to stand out among other similar games. A prime example of the usefulness of game feel is the success of Tetris Effect in providing a more meaningful experience for players than simply playing the classic version of the game. By juicing up the tried-and-true Tetris formula with fresh visuals, audio, and gameplay flow, Tetris Effect stands out among the other Tetris variants as a game that makes the classic puzzle feel new again.